Hello and welcome to Press TV's news analysis coming to you from Tehran. I'm Marzieh Hashemi. Thanks so much for being with us. Well, Israel has witnessed more mass demonstrations on Saturday as it seems its people's frustration is boiling over. Now, protesters chanted the only solution to privatization is revolution. Now, the new protest follows last week's demonstrations where at least 85 people were arrested. And what local people say that the government used heavy-handed tactics in trying to break up demonstrations. Now, protesters are demanding that the prices of food, housing, and education come down. Stay with us as we take a look at the growing dissatisfaction of the Israeli populace.
Fresh protest rallies by Israelis. Demonstrators in Tel Aviv are angry at what they call social inequality. The protest has been organized by the leaders of last summer's protests. They have just joined forces with the Israeli business community to draw up a kind of social justice covenant. But the protest rallies taking place in Israel these days are not just about social justice. Many have taken to the streets against the economic policies of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. A similar demonstration last week turned violent after angry protesters smashed the windows of banks to vent their anger at rising living costs. Police arrested scores of them. Israeli activists accused the police forces of brutality in dealing with the protest rallies. Protests in Israel began after the popular uprisings against regional despotic regimes engulfed the Middle East and North Africa. Israelis are increasingly frustrated with the dire economic situation in Israel. Tel Aviv receives billions of dollars in aid from Washington each year. Yet much of this aid goes to regime's war machine and occupying forces. And it's been of no help to improve the social and economic conditions in Israel. As for social justice, Israel is widely considered an apartheid regime with discriminatory first, second, and 11th class citizens. All residents are required to carry identification specifying their ethnic origin. The 11th class citizens, really not citizens at all, have basically no rights.
Well, I'd like to welcome my guest to the program from Chicago, writer and radio host, Mr. Stephen Lenman. From Beirut Center for Middle Eastern Studies and Public Relations, Mr. Mofid Jaber. Thank you all for being with us. Well, I'd like to start off in Chicago with Mr. Lenman.
Hello?
Let's look at some of the complaints of the demonstrators, Mr. Lenman, which is growing costs of housing, food, and education. Why is this such a major problem right now for the Israelis?
It's an extremely major problem, Marzieh. Social protests broke out last summer. They were unprecedented in Israel. What virtually no Americans, I shouldn't say no, but very few Americans understand how socially unjust Israel really is. For Jews, it's been for the last 3 decades. When America was stifling under Reaganomics and Britain was plagued by Thatcherism, and then in the 1990s, when shock therapy struck the former Soviet Union, and now austerity plagues the West, the two most unjust Western societies are Britain and America. Israel matches them. Extremely socially unjust. Arab citizens, 20% of the population, have no rights whatsoever. But increasingly, Jews are denied. They're denied basic social benefits they used to have decades ago. Neoliberal harshness replaced them. Healthcare, education, affordable housing, affordable food. These things are going by the wayside. Protests erupted last summer. They're beginning again this year.
Okay, well, let me turn to Beirut and get Mofid Jaber in on this discussion. Now, there would be many people looking at this situation, just listening now to Mr. Lindman and thinking that Tel Aviv gets at least $8.2 million a day from the United States in aid, and many would say a lot more. So why is it that it seems that they're having a difficult time? Is it mismanagement of the money, or is it something else in your perspective?
Well, firstly, the money that Israel gets from the U.S., most of it is destined to military expenses. And those that do go for economic development usually only benefit one part of the Israeli society, which is, the middle and upper classes and mostly the Ashkenazis in Israel. And so while there is some sort of economic development going on, with the higher classes and the Ashkenazi Jews, for instance, there is a large segment of the Israeli society that doesn't get to benefit from the economic development of Israel, which the U.S. greatly contributes to. So you have the Arab Israeli population, for instance. You also have the Haredis, who are the ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel, and you also have the problem of unemployment in Israel. You have a lot of very well, educated youth among the Jews in Israel who don't get there's the employment opportunities in Israel for the youth are scarce, and this is from these segments that we are seeing the most protest.
All right, let me turn to Berkeley and welcome author of Hidden History of Zionism, Mr. Ralph Shulman. Thank you so much for joining us. Sir, what's your take on all of this? And we've heard different perspectives, but is it that Israel has set up an elitist society and that the benefits are just going to a certain percentage of the masses? Or how do you see the problems that they're facing right now from an economic perspective?
Well, in the first place, we have to understand the parasitic nature of the Zionist state, which is essentially an extension of U.S. imperialism and its shock troops, subsidized and sustained in that way for a very long period of time, $100 billion in just the last 40 years, and that's just the official aid number. The numbers in reality are far greater than that, because these so-called loans are never called in, and the banking that's structured with respect to the Zionist state utilizes Israeli-controlled banks at far lower interest rates for the funds of major states such as California. So the Israeli state is an apparatus designed by imperialism to function as a shock troop in the region. Within that context, of course, as you've been describing, the structure of power in Israel is a parrot or image of the nature of corporate capitalism in its stage of terminal decay. There's a huge concentration of power in the hands of a tiny oligarchy, largely tied to the profiteering from military production for the imperium. But for the most part, the privileged in Israel are increasingly shrinking to a handful. According to the report in Agence France Presse today, the demands of the protesters in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and Haifa focused on not only what you quoted, the only solution to privatization is revolution, but power from this money is an underworld. They are labeling this oligarchy as gangsters, as a criminal class that is exploiting the rest of the population. And of course, within that structure, with a colonial settler state such as Israel, yes, the Ashkenazim, the European Jews, have always had a hegemony within the Jewish population. The so-called Arab Jews, the Mizrahim, are a highly exploited sector of the population, but a quarter step of the condition of the wholly exploited and dominated Palestinian people, the tormented Palestinian people whose land has been taken and usurped from them, and who are, by the Zionist intent, to be removed not only from their land but from history. But this protest is a mirror of the generalized uprising against capital that's taking place in the Occupy movement and the rank-and-file workers movement in the United States, replicated across Europe with its terminal crisis there. In Israel, as the report today says, This Israeli social movement has erupted with youths angry at the cost of housing and the cost of living, pitching tents in Tel Aviv in the middle of Rothschild Boulevard.
Okay.
Tent protests mushrooming with dozens of similar encampments spreading.
All right, let me, Mr. Shulman, let me get Mr. Lindman back in on this. Now, Mr. Lindman, what about that slogan that I mentioned and also that Mr. Shulman mentioned that the protesters are chanting? How significant is that particular slogan, that the only solution to privatization is revolution? And are we likely to see a growing schism in that society?
I really believe it, and I believe it's happening in the West as well. The slogan of the Occupy Wall Street movement is the only solution is world revolution. That's exactly right. That's what future trends watcher Gerald Celente says. He says it's coming. Nobody knows when, but angry people will only take so much, and then they will erupt. And the cancer of capitalism, predatory capitalism, is destroying Western societies, it's destroying Israel. The extreme wealth disparities between a tiny elite segment of society in these countries, whether we're talking about America, Israel, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, the same thing. People only take so much before they erupt. Another thing few people in America understand about Israel is there is a serious hunger problem. There is a homelessness problem. There is a poverty problem. There is an unemployment problem. You say this to American Jews and they'll think that you're nuts. They won't know what you're talking about. The U.S. media don't say anything about this, but it's a major problem in Israel. It's a major problem in America. It's a major problem across Europe. It's the same thing. Predatory neoliberal capitalism eating the heart out of the majority of people in the country, and they only take so much before they erupt. And when their protests aren't met, Netanyahu, Prime Minister, he promised change last year. He made promises. He broke his promises. People understand that. They're back again. This thing will rage all summer. I expect a long, hot summer. And if grievances aren't addressed, who knows when things will blow up.
Okay.
But we're heading for a major blow up,
and
not just in Israel.
Question to Mofid Jaber. Do you think that this will be a long, hot summer in Israel? And do you see that this dissatisfaction could actually play even a deeper role in the country or in the entity, that not only having an effect right now with the policies or with what they're complaining about, but actually making a better connection to what Palestinians go through on a daily basis, because more and more Israelis now are facing housing problems and other economic issues?
Look, unfortunately, the nature of Israeli society is such that the majority of the people are right-wing. As we've seen in the elections, the major three parties that won the majority of the seats in the Knesset are Kadima, which is a center-right party, Likud, which is a right-wing party, and Israel Beitenu, which is a far-right party. And so, while the Israelis are dissatisfied with these housing issues, with the rising prices of food items and of housing, they're very unlikely to change the nature of the system in Israel, because to them they're just probably more concerned about keeping a hold on the land than with economic problems, and so they're more likely to keep the government that is in place because it is more hawkish with regards to the Palestinians. And even though they have faced all of the same problems, probably much less serious, but they've had a glimpse of what the Palestinians go through. Even while they have seen that they're unlikely to actually sympathize with the Palestinians, and they're because as we've seen, the protests are largely confined to the Jewish population in Israel. And they're just showing their dissatisfaction, but I think it's unlikely that it will ever change make a change in the government structure.
All right, Mr. Shulman, your take on that same question. Do you think that perhaps there will be more empathy and that perhaps the Palestinians and some of the Jewish Israelis that actually could perhaps form some type of alliance to put more pressure on Tel Aviv? Or how do you see it?
Well, in the first place, I want to emphasize that in the mass demonstrations that unfolded on August 13th, 2011, there were joint demonstrations of Palestinians and Israelis in Haifa, and large numbers of Palestinians participated in the economic protests. They were carrying banners of support. I mean, not only the Palestinians, but the Israeli protests as well. Banners of support for Tahrir Square and for the uprising against Mubarak. And I should point out that the mass hunger strike that's unfolding in Israel as we speak amongst the Palestinians who are being tormented in the methods of punishment nothing short of torture has a profound impact on the population at large. There's a large solidarity movement amongst Israelis for the Palestinian people, protesting the occupation in the West Bank, protesting the continued building of settlements, protesting the imprisonment of thousands of political prisoners, of Palestinian militants and activists and fighters for Palestinian self-determination. All of this coincides with the general economic crisis of capital that is afflicting particularly a garrison state like Israel.
So what are you saying, Mr. Shulman? Are you saying that these two will be able to come together?
Are sick of these permanent wars, and there is a movement and a space for a non-Zionist, a de-Zionization of the state. That's the gravamen of these protests. The economy, the oligarchy, the torment of Palestinians, the condition of permanent war, the subordination to imperialism, and the dead end of capitalism across the planet, no less in Israel than anywhere else.
Mr. Shulman, if you can hear me, Mr. Shulman, if you can hear me, I want you to address this particular question that I'm asking. So are you saying that the Palestinians and the Israelis can actually come together on this issue and put more pressure on Tel Aviv and perhaps bring some types of changes, or what exactly are you saying?
I'm saying that the existing Zionist political parties cannot give voice to the aspirations of the population at large, including the settler population. As we saw in South Africa with the struggle against apartheid, it is emerging in Israel too. The radicalization around the nature of the economy and exploitation makes allies of the victim people, the Palestinian people, and the Israelis who aspire to a different future. And that future can only lie in a struggle against the Zionist nature of the state for a democratic and secular Palestine in which rights flow not from ethnicity or religious origin, but from citizenship as such.
Okay.
That is what animates this movement. That is what is radicalizing the population, and that is what is bringing the Jews themselves to the realization that Zionism is the dead end and traps them in a condition of permanent war, permanent occupation, permanent subjugation, and pits them against the aspirations of people around the world.
Okay.
They are sick of that syndrome. They are aligning themselves with the people who are struggling.
All right. Well, let me turn to Chicago. Mr. Lindman, your take on that. Mr. Lindman, with the situation right now that Mr. Shulman has discussed, are you optimistic that the Palestinians and also the Israelis can actually come together on this issue? And if so, let's look at what the possible response would be from the Tel Aviv regime, because we've already seen that in previous demonstrations, they came down hard on the protesters. And if this was to escalate, and if they were to come together in solidarity, what likely scenario would we witness coming from the Tel Aviv regime?
Well, I hope Ralph is right. I honestly have not seen this myself. True enough, the Palestinians that Ralph speaks about who have participated in these protests are Israeli Arabs, Israeli citizens. Of course, Palestinians in the territories cannot get into Israel, so they have no part in this. But the numbers of Arab citizens participating are tiny compared to the Jewish participants. So I don't see a strong connection, a tenuous connection I see. But I think the issue for Israeli Jews is social inequality, aside from the Palestinian issue, and resolving justice for Palestinians in the territories, and for Israeli Arabs, Israeli citizens. I see this as light years away. I don't see Israeli Jews getting that exercised about this. Modestly, yes. More angry about injustice affecting them. And another story that never gets publicity in the West or in America is there are a lot of Israeli Jews that are very upset, and they vote with their feet by leaving. They're leaving Israel. They're fed up with it. They want no more of it, and it could be that this exodus will pick up. Again, it never gets reported, but we're many, many years away from the Palestinians in the territories getting real help. I write about that all the time. The repression is horrific. It's unrelenting. I see nothing, no world leaders, nothing coming to their aid. It just continues coming down on them harshly. I'm doing what I can to spread the word about it. It is absolutely unbearable what they're putting up with.
All right, and Mr. Mofid Jaber, your take on this. Do you see this turning into something even bigger than it has already come? Or do you think that the Tel Aviv regime would come down very hard on the demonstrators if it escalates?
No, I find it very, very highly unlikely. First, let me start by saying that the anti-Zionist movement in Israel is largely confined to Ashkenazi, well-off, educated people who live in northern Tel Aviv. This is where the anti-Zionist movement is confined within Israeli Jewish society. But the majority of those who demonstrated for social purposes in Israel are mostly Zionist Jews who belong to the lower echelons of society. They may be Ashkenazim, they may be Mizrahim and Sephardim, and they have very, very little concern for the Palestinian cause. And I find it very unlikely that it will ever, turn into, as I said, a change in the government's structure. Because if we look at the voting trends in Israel, as I said, most of the Israeli society mostly votes to the right, and seeing as though the majority of the Israeli society votes either for Likud and Kadima and Israel Beitenu, this is the current makeup of the Israeli government, and so it's very unlikely that it will ever cause a change in the government structure.
Okay, and closing, I'm just about out of time. I just want to give 30 seconds to Mr. Showman. Mr. Showman, your take on all of this. What do you think will come out of this? 30 seconds only.
I think that what we've been listening to is a little bit mechanical. Naim Jaladi, who was the founder of the Black Panther movement amongst the Mizrahim a quarter of a century ago, expresses the reality that there is a huge exploitation of the Mizrahim, and they have made common cause with the Palestinian people on many concrete instances. It is growing. There's a shared reality. The political parties that our associate in Beirut is describing correspond to the monopoly of political power in the United States by the Democrats and Republicans, or in other societies. Yes, these political parties are the parties of the tiny Zionist oligarchy apparatus. There is no political organization as such that contests
I'm
elections.
sorry, we are out of time, but I thank you, everyone. First of all, thanking Mr. Stephen Lidman in Chicago, writer and radio host in Beirut, Mr. Mofid Jaber, Center for Middle East Studies and Public Relations, and in Berkeley, Mr. Ralph Showman, author of Hidden History of Zionism. And as always, viewers, we'd like to thank you for being with us. Join us right here, same time, same place tomorrow for another top look at one of tomorrow's top stories. Well, I'm Marzieh Hashemi, signing out for myself and all the crew right here in Tehran. Thank you so much for being with us, and goodbye.